Behind the towering walls of royal tradition, a moment unfolded that was never meant for public eyes. No cameras, no announcements, no protocol. A quiet exchange between Princess Alexandra and Catherine, Princess of Wales, would ignite whispers across palace corridors. The tiara, one tied to legacy, loyalty, and long-standing tension, was passed not through ceremony, but through trust. And from that moment on, nothing inside the monarchy would remain untouched. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What made this moment so unsettling was not just its secrecy, but the deliberate nature of it. Nothing about it was accidental. Princess Alexandra had spent a lifetime understanding the invisible rules that governed the monarchy, the quiet expectations, the unspoken boundaries, the weight of what must be seen and what must remain hidden. And yet, in this single act, she chose to step outside all of it. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but with a calm certainty that suggested this had been building for far longer than anyone realized. Catherine, standing on the receiving end of this decision, felt it immediately. This was not a gift wrapped in celebration. It was something heavier, something that carried consequences she could not yet fully see. There was no audience to soften the weight of the exchange. No formal words to frame it as duty or tradition, just a quiet understanding passing between two women who both knew that this moment would never be acknowledged publicly, yet would echo privately in ways that could not be contained. Catherine's hesitation was not weakness, it was awareness. She understood what it meant to accept something that had not been offered through official channels. She understood the delicate balance she had spent years maintaining. And in that instant, she felt it shift, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to know that nothing would feel quite the same again, because the tiara itself was not neutral. It never had been. It carried with it a history that did not sit comfortably within the current structure of power. It belonged to a lineage that had always existed slightly outside the monarchy's control, a quiet reminder that not all influence flowed from the crown. By placing it in Catherine's hands, Alexandra wasn't just honoring the past, she was reintroducing something the institution had long learned to keep at a distance. And that was where the true tension began to take shape. What made it even more striking was the choice to bypass every expected protocol. Gifts of this magnitude were not supposed to move in silence. They were meant to be recorded, acknowledged, absorbed into the official narrative. But this one slipped through without permission, without announcement, without the usual layers of approval. That alone transformed it from a gesture into something far more complex. It suggested intention. It suggested that this was not about tradition at all, but about rewriting it quietly, carefully, and without asking for consent. And almost immediately, even without a single word spoken beyond that private space, the shift began to ripple outward. Not visibly, not in ways that could be easily traced, but in subtle changes, pauses in conversation, glances held a second too long, an unspoken awareness that something had happened. Those who understood the deeper currents of the monarchy didn't need confirmation, they could feel it. Because acts like this didn't stay contained, they never did. And beneath it all, there was a growing, undeniable truth beginning to form. This was never just about a tiara, it was about alignment, about trust, about choosing sides in a way that could not be undone once made. Catherine may not have fully realized it yet, but by accepting that piece of history, she had stepped into something far more dangerous than expectation. She had stepped into quiet defiance, and in a system built on control, even the smallest act of defiance has a way of becoming something much bigger than anyone intended. But what made this tiara so powerful wasn't just its beauty, it was the history buried within it. Long before it rested in Catherine's hands, the Spencer tiara carried the weight of rebellion, heartbreak, and silent defiance. It was more than jewelry, it was identity. A legacy that whispered of Princess Diana, of independence within a system built on control. And now, its reappearance inside palace walls wasn't just unexpected, it was provocative. Because some legacies aren't meant to return, especially not like this. What made the Spencer tiara different was not its brilliance or its craftsmanship, but the story it refused to let go of. It was never absorbed fully into the monarchy's carefully managed image. It remained in many ways untouched, belonging to a lineage that did not entirely bend to royal expectation. That alone made it powerful, not loudly, not openly, but in a way that lingered beneath the surface, quietly challenging the idea that all influence must flow through the crown. And for those who understood its history, that quiet challenge was impossible to ignore. It carried echoes of Princess Diana in ways that could never be erased, not just her presence, but her resistance, the way she navigated a system that often tried to define her, limit her, reshape her. The tiara became more than something she wore. It became something she carried, a symbol of where she came from and what she refused to lose. Even when everything else around her shifted, that connection remained untouched. And now, years later, that same symbol had found its way back into the very heart of the institution that once struggled to contain her. That was where the tension deepened. Because the tiara did not just represent memory, it represented an alternative, a different kind of authority, one rooted not in hierarchy, but in emotional allegiance. It stood as a reminder that loyalty within the monarchy was never as simple as it appeared. There were layers to it, invisible ties that ran deeper than titles or positions. And by reintroducing the tiara into this environment, Alexandra was not simply honoring the past, she was bringing those hidden loyalties back into focus. For Catherine, this meant stepping into a space that was far more complex than it seemed. Accepting the tiara was not just about accepting a legacy, it was about inheriting its unresolved tensions. The weight of what it symbolized could not be separated from what it might provoke. And somewhere beneath the surface, there was an unspoken understanding beginning to take shape. This was not just about remembrance, it was about alignment, about what the tiara now signaled to those watching closely enough to understand its meaning. And they were watching, quietly, carefully, without drawing attention, but they were watching. Because within the monarchy, symbols often speak louder than declarations. And this symbol in particular had a history of unsettling the balance. It did not fit neatly into the present structure. It never had, which is why its sudden reappearance felt less like a coincidence and more like a disruption, one that could not easily be explained away. Alexandra would have known this. She would have understood exactly what it meant to bring that history forward again, to place it into hands that now stood at the center of the monarchy's future. This was not nostalgia, it was intention. A quiet but deliberate move that suggested she saw something others either ignored or chose not to confront. Perhaps she believed that some legacies should not be buried, or perhaps she believed that certain truths, no matter how uncomfortable, eventually find their way back. And that is what made this moment so unsettling. Not just the tiara itself, but what it represented returning at this exact point in time. Because when history resurfaces like this, it rarely does so without consequence. It brings with it old tensions, unresolved questions, and the possibility that what once remained hidden may not stay that way for long. And yet, as powerful as the tiara's history was, the real shock came from who was deliberately kept away from it. When Queen Camilla made a simple request to view the tiara, she expected protocol to open doors. Instead, she was met with something almost unheard of within royal circles: a refusal, not delayed, not reconsidered, refused, and in that single moment, a quiet gift turned into a silent rebellion, one that would ripple through every level of palace power. At first, it was presented as routine, a request framed within the language of tradition, of curiosity, of rightful access. Nothing about it, on the surface, appeared unusual, but beneath that calm exterior, there was intent, sharp, deliberate, and impossible to miss for those who understood how power truly moved within the monarchy. This was not simply about seeing the tiara. It was about acknowledging it, positioning it, and perhaps most importantly, reclaiming control over something that had slipped, however briefly, beyond reach. And yet, what came back was not hesitation or polite delay. It was something far more final. Princess Alexandra did not negotiate. She did not soften the edges of her response. There were no careful explanations, no layered diplomacy, no attempt to disguise the decision. It was a refusal delivered with a quiet certainty that made it all the more unsettling. Because within royal circles, denial is rarely absolute. It is softened, redirected, reshaped until it no longer feels like rejection. But this was unmistakable. That was the moment everything shifted. Not loudly, not publicly, but in a way that those closest to the inner workings of the palace could feel immediately. Staff who had spent years navigating the delicate balance of hierarchy suddenly found themselves in unfamiliar territory. Conversations grew more cautious, reactions more measured, because if a request like this could be denied so cleanly, so decisively, then the rules themselves were no longer as fixed as they once seemed. For Catherine, the weight of this tension became impossible to ignore. She had not asked for confrontation. She had not sought to become the center of a silent conflict. And yet, without speaking a single word, she now stood directly within it. The tiara she had accepted in quiet trust had become something else entirely, a focal point for unspoken divisions, a symbol that carried implications she could no longer distance herself from. Every step forward now required a deeper awareness, a sharper understanding of the forces beginning to gather around her. What made it even more complex was the meaning behind the refusal itself. In a system where access often defines authority, denying that access was not a small act. It was a statement, a line drawn without announcement but felt by everyone who mattered. It suggested that influence was shifting, not in ways that could be declared, but in ways that could be sensed. And once that shift begins, it rarely stops at a single moment. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the first signs of division began to emerge, not through open disagreement, but through alignment, subtle, careful, and deeply strategic. Some leaned toward preserving the established order, holding tightly to the structures that had always defined control. Others, perhaps more quietly, seemed to recognize something different unfolding, something that could not easily be reversed. And in the middle of it all, the tiara remained not as an object, but as a question no one was ready to answer out loud. Because beneath every conversation, every measured response, there was a growing realization that this was not an isolated incident. It was the beginning of something larger, a shift that would not announce itself, but would instead move through the monarchy in quiet, undeniable ways. And those who understood this knew one thing for certain: once a boundary like this is crossed, it does not simply reset. Because this wasn't just about access, it was about power and who was quietly redefining it. Catherine had always understood the rules: when to speak, when to remain silent, when to step back. But this was different. Holding the Spencer tiara wasn't just an honor, it was a responsibility she never publicly asked for. And yet, in accepting it, she stepped into something far more dangerous than tradition. She stepped into influence. At first, the weight of it revealed itself quietly, almost imperceptibly. There were no immediate confrontations, no direct accusations, no sudden upheaval, but internally, something had shifted. Catherine could feel it in the way decisions now carried an added layer of consequence, in the way silence itself began to feel heavier than words. She had spent years mastering the art of balance, knowing exactly how to exist within a system that demanded both presence and restraint. But the tiara disrupted that balance in a way she could not ignore. It wasn't just what it represented, it was what it now asked of her. Because with it came expectation, even if no one spoke it aloud. There was an understanding, subtle yet undeniable, that accepting something so deeply tied to a different legacy meant stepping into that legacy's unfinished story. Catherine was no longer simply navigating the present, she was now carrying echoes of the past, expectations shaped by memory, by loyalty, by quiet defiance that had never fully faded. And that realization did not empower her in the way one might expect. It complicated her, it forced her to question where duty ended and identity began. The conflict within her was not visible, but it was constant. On one side stood everything she had built: her discipline, her patience, her careful adherence to the structure that defined her role. On the other side stood something, far less defined, yet far more powerful. A connection to something that existed outside that structure, something that did not ask for permission or approval. And somewhere between those two forces, Catherine found herself standing in unfamiliar territory, aware that whichever direction she leaned toward would shape not just her future, but the future of how she was perceived within the monarchy. What made it even more intense was the growing awareness that she was being watched. Not openly, not in ways that could be easily acknowledged, but in subtle, calculated observation. Every movement, every choice, every silence began to carry new meaning. Those within the palace who understood the deeper implications of the tiara were no longer just observing Catherine. As she had been, they were studying what she was becoming. And that shift in perception was impossible to reverse once it began. Slowly, almost without intention, her role started to evolve, not through titles or declarations, but through presence, through the quiet authority that comes when others begin to see you differently, when they begin to recognize that something has changed even if they cannot fully explain it. Catherine was no longer just part of the system. She was becoming a point of connection between two forces that had long existed in tension. The institution, as it stood, and the legacy that refused to be forgotten. And that was where the real transformation began. Not in what she said or did, but in what she represented. A bridge, whether she intended it or not. A figure who carried both continuity and disruption within the same breath. And with that came a realization that could not be undone. This moment was not temporary. It was not something that would fade or settle quietly into the background. It was a turning point, one that would continue to unfold in ways she could not yet predict, because influence, once it takes root, does not remain still. It grows, it shifts, it challenges everything around it, and Catherine, whether she was ready or not, had become part of that process. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that would prove far more lasting, a quiet rise, built not on declaration, but on presence. And that kind of rise is often the hardest to control. But Catherine's quiet rise did not go unnoticed, especially by those who stood to lose the most. There was no public outburst, no visible confrontation. But inside the palace, Queen Camilla was watching, calculating, because in a system built on hierarchy, being denied even once wasn't just unusual, it was dangerous. And what followed wasn't reaction, it was strategy. A quiet, deliberate shift that suggested this was far from over. What made her response so unsettling was how controlled it remained. There were no signs of frustration, no indication that anything had disrupted her composure. But beneath that calm exterior, something had already begun to move. Camilla understood the language of power better than most, not the kind spoken openly, but the kind that unfolds in silence, in timing, in knowing when to act and when to wait. And in that moment, she chose patience, not because she lacked options, but because she was deciding which one would carry the greatest impact. The refusal had not weakened her position, but it had challenged it, and that distinction mattered, because within the monarchy, perception often holds more weight than reality. To be denied access even privately created a subtle shift in how authority could be interpreted. Camilla knew this. She knew that if left unanswered, even quietly, it could begin to reshape the way influence was measured within the palace. So she did not confront it directly. Instead, she began to reposition. Conversations started to happen behind closed doors, carefully chosen, precisely timed, not confrontational, not overtly strategic, but deliberate enough to restore a sense of alignment where it mattered most. She reinforced connections that had always supported her, reminded certain individuals without needing to say it outright where stability still resided. And at the same time, she observed, closely, because understanding where the feat was coming from was just as important as knowing how to respond to it. What made this moment particularly complex was the balance she had to maintain. React too strongly, and it would expose the very tension she was trying to contain. Remain too passive, and it could be interpreted as acceptance. And in a system where silence can carry as much meaning as action, that line became increasingly difficult to navigate. Every move had to be measured, every response calculated to preserve authority without drawing attention to the fact that it had been challenged at all. But beneath that strategy, there was something else, something quieter, but no less significant. An awareness that the structure she had relied on was no longer as predictable as it once was. The emergence of influence that did not follow traditional pathways, that did not seek validation through established channels, introduced a level of uncertainty that could not be easily managed. And uncertainty, within a system built on control, is always a risk. Because this was no longer just about a single refusal or a single decision, it was about what that decision represented, a shift in how power could be expressed, who could hold it, and how it could move without being formally acknowledged. And the more Camilla considered this, the clearer it became that this was not something that could simply be corrected or redirected. It was something that would need to be countered carefully, quietly, and over time. Meanwhile, the divide that had begun to form grew more defined, even if it remained unspoken. On one side stood the structure that had always governed the monarchy, built on continuity, order, and control. On the other side, something less structured but increasingly influential began to take shape, not openly, not aggressively, but in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And as that divide widened, the space between them became more difficult to navigate. Camilla understood what this meant, not immediately, not all at once, but in the gradual realization that this situation would not resolve itself quietly. It would build, it would evolve, and eventually, it would demand a response that could no longer remain hidden behind strategy alone. But until that moment arrived, she would continue to watch, to calculate, to position herself where she needed to be when the balance finally shifted again. And as strategies began to unfold, others within the palace were forced to choose sides. The monarchy has always thrived on unity, or at least the appearance of it. But behind closed doors, something was shifting. Quiet conversations turned into careful alignments. Loyalties were no longer assumed, they were tested. And as the story of the tiara spread in whispers, the palace began to fracture, not loudly, but unmistakably. At first, the divide was almost invisible, hidden beneath routine and tradition. No one announced their position. No one needed to. It revealed itself in smaller ways, in who spoke more cautiously, in who chose their words more deliberately, in who lingered in certain conversations and avoided others. The tiara had not just introduced tension. It had exposed something that had always existed beneath the surface, a quiet competition between loyalty to the institution and loyalty to something more personal, more emotional, and far less predictable. For some, the choice was simple. Tradition had always been the foundation of the monarchy, and anything that threatened to disrupt that balance was met with quiet resistance. These were the individuals who believed stability must come before sentiment, that order must be preserved at all costs. To them, the tiara represented a complication, an unnecessary reopening of a past that had been carefully contained. Their alignment leaned naturally toward maintaining the structure, toward ensuring that what had always worked would continue to hold. But for others, the shift felt different. There was something about the reappearance of the Spencer legacy that stirred a deeper response. Not rebellion, not outright defiance, but recognition. A sense that the monarchy was not as fixed as it appeared, that influence could too take forms that were not dictated solely by hierarchy. These individuals did not openly challenge the system, but their perspective began to shift, and in that shift, their loyalty became less predictable, less tied to tradition alone. Caught between these quiet alignments were those who understood both sides, who saw the risk in change, but also the inevitability of it. Their position was the most fragile, because in a palace where every movement carries meaning, remaining neutral is often the most dangerous choice of all. And as the tension grew, neutrality became harder to maintain. Every silence, every decision, every association began to signal something, whether intended or not. And then there was Alexandra. Her presence within this growing divide was subtle yet impossible to ignore. She had not spoken publicly, had not explained her decision, had not attempted to guide the narrative in any visible way, and yet her influence moved quietly through the palace, shaping conversations without ever appearing to control them. That was what made her role so powerful. She had not just introduced the tiara into this environment, she had introduced a question. And questions within a system built on certainty have a way of unsettling everything. What made the situation even more intense was how contained it remained. Nothing had reached the public. No headlines, no official statement, no visible cracks in the monarchy's carefully maintained image. But inside, the pressure was building, slowly, steadily, in ways that could not be easily released. Because once loyalties begin to shift, they rarely return to where they were. They evolve, they deepen, they create new lines that cannot be erased. And beneath it all, there was a growing awareness that this was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of something larger. The tiara had become more than a symbol. It had become a catalyst. a moment that revealed underlying tensions that could no longer remain hidden indefinitely. And as those tensions continued to rise, the question was no longer whether the monarchy would shape, but how and who would shape that change when it finally surfaced. But beneath all of this, one question remained unanswered. Why did Alexandra choose Catherine? Was it loyalty? Was it defiance? Or was it something far more calculated? Princess Alexandra had never been impulsive. Every move she made carried meaning, and this was no exception. Because giving Catherine the Spencer tiara wasn't just about the past, it was about the future, and perhaps a future she no longer trusted others to protect. To understand the weight behind her decision, you have to look beyond the moment itself and into the pattern of who she has always been. Alexandra was not someone who acted for attention or disruption. She understood the system too well to mistake noise for influence. Her strength had always been restraint, precision, and timing, which is exactly why this decision felt so significant. It broke the surface of her usual silence, but not in a way that invited chaos. It was controlled, intentional, almost as if she had been waiting for the exact moment when such a move would matter most. There were whispers, quiet, unconfirmed, but persistent, that her connection to Diana's legacy ran deeper than most realized, not through grand gestures or public statements, but through an understanding of what Diana represented beneath the surface. Independence, emotional truth, a refusal to be fully absorbed by a system that often demanded it. Alexandra had watched that legacy unfold, had seen both its strength and its cost, and perhaps, over time, she had come to believe that such a legacy should not simply fade into memory, reshaped by narratives that no longer reflected its original meaning. That is where the decision begins to take on a different shape. Because this was not just about honoring Diana, it was about preserving something that Alexandra may have felt was at risk of being lost entirely. And in Catherine, she may have seen a rare balance, someone capable of carrying that legacy without being consumed by it, someone who understood restraint, yet possessed the quiet strength that needed to hold something that could not be controlled by tradition alone. This is what transforms the gesture from something symbolic into something strategic. It suggests endorsement, yes, but not in a way that seeks approval or recognition. It is a quieter form of alignment, a signal, not broadcast to the public, but understood by those who know how to read between the lines. Alexandra was not placing Catherine above anyone. She was placing something within her reach, something that would shape how others began to see her, whether they chose to acknowledge it or not. And perhaps most telling of all was the possibility that this was never meant to challenge the monarchy directly. It was meant to protect something within it, a future that Alexandra may have sensed was becoming increasingly fragile, because when institutions grow too rigid, they risk losing the very elements that once made them resilient. And by reintroducing this legacy in such a deliberate way, she may have been attempting to restore a balance that could not be achieved through official channels alone. There is also a deeper layer to consider, one that speaks not just to what Alexandra did, but to what she may have anticipated. Moves like this are rarely made without foresight, without an awareness of what could follow. And if she understood that tension within the monarchy was already beginning to shift, this decision becomes something else entirely. Not reactive, but preemptive, a quiet preparation for something she believed was coming, even if no one else was ready to see it yet. And that is what makes her role so difficult to define. She is not at the center of the conflict, yet she has influenced its direction. She has not spoken, yet her actions have reshaped the conversation, and in doing so, she has introduced a level of uncertainty that cannot be undone. Because once a move like this is made, it continues to unfold, revealing its impact slowly, in ways that are impossible to fully control. And as the meaning behind the gift began to surface, its consequences became impossible to contain. What began as a private gesture had transformed into something far greater. The tiara was no longer hidden, it was felt. In conversations, in glances, in decisions left unspoken. It had become a symbol, not just of legacy, but of resistance. And in a monarchy built on image, symbols have power sometimes more than crowns themselves. At first, its influence moved quietly, almost invisibly, threading its way through the palace in ways that could not be formally acknowledged. No one spoke about it directly, yet everyone adjusted around it. Conversations carried a different weight. Decisions, once routine, now felt measured against something unspoken. The tiara had introduced a new presence into the monarchy, one that did not rely on rank or title, but on meaning. And meaning, unlike authority, is far more difficult to control. It began to shape behavior in subtle ways. Those who once operated with certainty now hesitated, reconsidering how their actions might be interpreted in the shadow of what the tiara represented. It was no longer just an object held by Catherine, it had become a silent reference point. A reminder that something within the system had shifted, even if no one dared to define it openly, and with each passing moment, that shift grew more undeniable. For Catherine, the realization deepened with every passing day. What she had accepted as a gesture of trust had evolved into something far more complex. She could feel the weight of it, not just in expectation, but in perception. The way others looked at her had changed, not dramatically, not in ways that could be easily confronted, but enough to make it clear that she was no longer standing in the same position she once held. The tiara had altered how she was seen, and in doing so, it had begun to alter what she represented, and that was where the tension reached its most fragile point. Because symbols like this do not remain contained. They seek expression, they push toward visibility. The idea of the tiara remaining hidden began to feel less like a certainty and more like a temporary delay, and with that came a growing question: what would happen if it were ever seen publicly? Not just worn, not just acknowledged, but revealed in a way that could not be undone. The implications of that possibility were impossible to ignore. A public appearance would not just confirm the tiara's presence, it would amplify its meaning. It would force the monarchy to confront something it had so far managed to keep beneath the surface. And for those who understood the deeper layers of what this symbol carried, the risk was clear. Once something like this enters the public eye, it no longer belongs to private interpretation. It becomes part of a larger narrative, one that cannot be easily shaped or contained. And yet, there was also a sense that this moment was inevitable, that what had been set in motion could not simply be reversed or quieted. The tiara had already done its work. It had shifted perception, redefined alignment, introduced a new layer of influence that did not rely on formal recognition. And once that kind of shift takes hold, it does not fade, it evolves. Beneath all of this, there was a growing awareness that the monarchy was approaching something significant, not an event that could be predicted or scheduled, but a moment of exposure, a point where the tension between what is hidden and what is known could no longer be sustained. And when that moment arrived, it would not just reveal the tiara, it would reveal everything surrounding it. The choices, the divisions, the quiet acts of defiance that had led to this point, because symbols like this do not exist without consequence. They carry meaning forward, whether acknowledged or not. They challenge structures, reshape perceptions, and force those within them to confront truths they might otherwise avoid. And the Spencer tiara, now at the center of this unfolding tension, had become exactly that kind of symbol, impossible to ignore, impossible to fully control. Because in the end, secrets like this don't stay hidden forever, they demand to be revealed. It was only a matter of time. Secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, have a way of finding light, and when this one does, it won't just expose a hidden gift. It will expose fractures, loyalties, and truths the monarchy has long tried to keep buried. Because sometimes, the most powerful revolutions don't begin with a crown, but with who is allowed to wear it. By now, the tension had reached a point where silence itself felt unstable. The tiara, once protected by secrecy, now carried a presence too strong to remain hidden forever. It lingered in conversations that stopped just short of acknowledgement, in decisions that seemed carefully timed, in a growing awareness that something inevitable was approaching. The question was no longer if it would surface, but when. And more importantly, what would happen when it did. Because once the truth moves into the open, it stops belonging to those who tried to contain it. It becomes something larger, something uncontrollable. For the monarchy, that meant facing not just the existence of the tiara, but everything it had come to represent. The quiet divisions, the shifting loyalties, the unspoken resistance that had been building beneath the surface for far longer than anyone had admitted. Exposure would not simply reveal a moment, it would reveal a pattern. For Catherine, this moment marked the final stage of a transformation she had never publicly chosen, yet could no longer step away from. She was no longer navigating influence, she had become it. Not through declaration, not through assertion, but through the accumulation of everything that had led to this point. The tiara had not defined her, but it had amplified something already within her. And now, as the possibility of revelation grew closer, so did the understanding that her position within the monarchy had changed permanently. But with that transformation came consequence. Because influence does not rise without resistance, for Camilla, the shifting dynamic was no longer subtle, it was undeniable. The balance she had carefully maintained was no longer fixed, and the strategies that once ensured stability now faced an unpredictable force, not loud, not confrontational, but deeply rooted and increasingly difficult to contain. And in that realization, there was a quiet tension that could no longer be managed through patience alone. And then there was Alexandra, the one who had set everything in motion without ever stepping into the center of it. Her role remained quiet, almost invisible to those who did not understand the depth of her decision. But for those who did, the picture had become clear. This had never been a simple gesture. It had been a calculated act of influence, one designed not to disrupt the monarchy openly, but to reshape it from within. Slowly, deliberately, irreversibly. What made this moment so powerful was not the exposure itself, but what it meant for the future. Because once something like this surfaces, it does not fade back into silence. It alters perception. It changes how authority is understood, how loyalty is measured, how influence is recognized. And a monarchy, built so carefully on continuity, now stood at the edge of something it could not fully control, a shift that had already begun, long before anyone realized it. And that is where the uncertainty remains, not in what has already happened, but in what comes next. Because revelations like this do not end stories, they begin new ones where the rules are less certain, the boundaries less defined, and the outcomes impossible too. Oh, predict. The tiara may have been the catalyst, but what it uncovered runs far deeper than a single moment or a single decision. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all, this was never just about a tiara. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.